The auction house was nearly empty when Daniel Mercer walked through the doors, his German Shepherd Rex padding silently beside him. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of gray autumn day when most people stayed home and contemplated the coming winter. But Daniel had received a notice in the mail that had drawn him out of the solitude he had carefully constructed over the past 3 years. A notice informing him that the estate of Margaret Holloway was being liquidated, and that, as a distant relative, he was entitled to claim any items of sentimental value before the public auction began.
Daniel was 61 years old, a retired Army Special Forces colonel who had spent 30 years serving in conflicts around the world that most Americans knew nothing about. His face bore the weathered look of a man who had seen too much sun and too much death, with deep lines around his eyes and a scar that traced a pale path from his left temple to his jaw. His hair had gone completely gray in his 50s, and he kept it cut short in the military style that had defined his adult life.
He moved with a slight limp, the result of an injury in Afghanistan that had finally convinced him to accept the retirement that the Army had been suggesting for years. Rex was 7 years old, a former military working dog who had served 2 tours detecting explosives before a hearing injury had forced his retirement. Daniel had adopted him through a program that matched retired working dogs with veterans, and from the moment they had met, something had clicked between them.
Rex seemed to understand the particular kind of brokenness that Daniel carried, and Daniel understood the way Rex's ears would flatten at loud noises, the way his body would tense when approached too quickly from behind. They were 2 veterans, man and dog, navigating civilian life together with the wariness of soldiers who had learned that danger could come from anywhere.
Margaret Holloway had been Daniel's great-aunt, though he had met her only a handful of times throughout his life. She had been his grandmother's sister, a woman who had never married and had lived alone in her Victorian house in the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut for as long as anyone could remember. Daniel's memories of her were vague and fragmentary, impressions of a stern-faced woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, who had seemed ancient even when he was a child.
She had died 3 months ago, at the age of 97, leaving behind a house full of antiques and a family tree with no direct heirs. The lawyers had tracked down the distant relatives, Daniel among them, and offered them the chance to claim family heirlooms before everything was sold. Daniel hadn't intended to come. He had no interest in antiques, no room in his small cabin for the accumulated possessions of a woman he barely remembered. But something about the notice had nagged at him, some instinct honed by decades of intelligence work that told him there was more to this than a simple estate sale. So here he was, walking through a building filled with the remnants of Margaret Holloway's long life, Rex at his side, searching for something he couldn't name. The auction house had arranged the items by category, with furniture in one section, artwork in another, jewelry and personal effects in a third. Daniel moved through the rooms slowly, running his hands over tables and chairs that had once filled his great-aunt's home, looking at paintings and photographs that documented a life he knew nothing about. Rex followed close behind, his nose working the air, alert to the sense of 100 different people who had passed through this space.
It was in the art section that Rex's behavior changed.
Daniel didn't notice it at first, absorbed as he was in examining a collection of landscapes that appeared to date from the early 20th century. But gradually, he became aware that Rex was no longer at his side. He turned to look for the dog and found him standing perfectly still about 20 feet away, staring at a painting that hung on the far wall. The painting was unremarkable at first glance, a portrait of a young woman in what appeared to be 1940s attire. She was beautiful, with dark hair swept up in the style of the era, and eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer with an expression that was difficult to read. She was wearing a dark green dress and a simple pearl necklace, and she was seated in a chair that looked familiar to Daniel, though he couldn't immediately place why. Rex was staring at this painting with an intensity that Daniel had rarely seen outside of active duty. The dog's body was rigid, his ears pricked forward, his eyes fixed on the canvas with an unwavering focus that suggested he was detecting something that human senses couldn't perceive. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't make any sound at all. He simply stood and stared, as if the painting contained a message that only he could read.
Daniel approached slowly, not wanting to startle the dog. "Rex," he said softly. "What is it, boy? What do you see?"
Rex didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge Daniel's presence. His entire being was focused on the painting, on the woman who looked out from the canvas with those haunting, unreadable eyes.
Daniel studied the painting more carefully, trying to see what Rex was seeing. The woman was young, perhaps in her early 20s, and there was something about her features that seemed familiar. The shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the particular way her eyes tilted slightly at the corners. Daniel had the unsettling feeling that he was looking at someone he should recognize, someone whose identity was hovering just at the edge of his memory. He checked the small card that hung beside the painting, looking for information about the artist or the subject. But the card was almost blank, containing only a catalog number and a single word: unknown.
Unknown. A beautiful young woman, frozen forever in oil and canvas, her name and story lost to time. And a German shepherd who couldn't stop staring at her, as if he could sense something about her that transcended the physical reality of paint and frame.
Daniel made a decision. "I want this one," he said to the auction house attendant, who had been hovering nearby, watching the strange tableau of man and dog and painting with obvious curiosity. "Whatever the process is for claiming items, I want to claim this painting." The attendant nodded, making a note on her clipboard. "You'll need to sign some paperwork confirming your relationship to Mrs. Holloway, and I should let you know that several other items have already been claimed by other family members. But the painting," she checked her records, "the painting is still available. I don't think anyone else was interested." Daniel wasn't surprised. The painting was competently executed, but not exceptional. The kind of portrait that wealthy families commissioned to document their members, but that held little value for anyone outside the bloodline. It was exactly the kind of thing that would be overlooked by relatives seeking valuable antiques. But Rex hadn't overlooked it, and Daniel had learned to trust Rex's instincts. He signed the paperwork, claimed the painting, and carried it out to his truck with Rex walking beside him, still glancing back at the canvas with that same intense focus. Whatever the dog sensed about this portrait, it had captured his attention completely, and Daniel was determined to find out why.
The drive back to his cabin in the mountains of Vermont took nearly 4 hours, during which Daniel found his thoughts constantly returning to the painting secured in the bed of his truck. The woman's face kept appearing in his mind, those haunting eyes looking out of him with an expression that seemed to hold secrets, to promise revelations, if only he could understand what she was trying to say. His cabin was a modest structure, built in the 1950s and updated over the decades to include modern conveniences while retaining its rustic character. Daniel had bought it 3 years ago, shortly after his retirement, seeking the kind of isolation that would allow him to process the decades of experiences that weighed on his conscience. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and the nearest town was a 15-minute drive down a winding mountain road. It was exactly the kind of solitude that Daniel needed, a place where the silence was broken only by the wind in the trees and the calls of birds and the occasional sound of Rex exploring the forest that surrounded their home. He carried the painting inside and leaned it against the wall of his living room, then stepped back to study it in the warm light of the cabin's interior. The woman seemed different here, somehow more present, her gaze following him as he moved around the room. Rex immediately positioned himself in front of the painting, resuming the fixed stare that he had maintained at the auction house.
"What is it about her, boy?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside the dog. "What do you see?"
Rex whined softly, a sound that Daniel had learned to interpret as frustration. The dog wanted something, needed something, but couldn't communicate what it was. His nose twitched as he sniffed toward the painting, and Daniel realized that Rex wasn't just looking at the canvas, he was smelling it. The insight struck Daniel like a thunderbolt. Rex was a former explosives detection dog, trained to identify specific scents that indicated the presence of dangerous materials. His nose was one of the most sensitive instruments on the planet, capable of detecting chemicals in concentrations that human technology couldn't measure. If Rex was fixated on this painting, it wasn't because of what he could see, it was because of what he could smell.
There was something hidden in this painting, something that Rex's incredible nose had detected, something that had been concealed for decades, waiting to be discovered.
Daniel approached the painting with new purpose, examining it with the careful attention of a man who had spent his career looking for things that others wanted to keep hidden. The frame was old, solid wood with an ornate gold finish that had dulled with age. The canvas was stretched tightly, showing no obvious signs of tampering or repair. But when Daniel lifted the painting and looked at its back, he noted something that made his heart beat faster.
The brown paper that covered the back of the frame, the kind of protective backing that was standard on paintings of this era, was slightly different in one corner. The color was marginally lighter, the texture slightly smoother, as if that section had been replaced at some point after the original framing.
Someone had opened this painting from the back. Someone had accessed whatever was behind the canvas, and then someone had carefully resealed it, doing their best to make the repair invisible.
But they hadn't counted on a dog with a nose that could detect scents decades old.
Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the utility knife in his pocket. He had spent 30 years uncovering secrets, finding hidden information that others wanted to keep buried. But this was different. This was personal, connected to his own family in ways he didn't yet understand. Whatever he found behind this canvas would change something, would reveal something that had been deliberately concealed for what might be a lifetime.
Rex whined again, louder this time, urging Daniel to continue. He made the first cut carefully, slicing through the brown paper along the edge of the frame. The old paper parted easily, releasing a faint musty odor that spoke of decades sealed away from the air. Daniel continued cutting, working his way around the perimeter of the frame until the entire backing could be lifted away. What he found behind it made him turn pale. There was a package, flat and rectangular, wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. But that wasn't what had drained the color from Daniel's face. What had shocked him was the object that sat on top of the package, carefully placed so that whoever removed the backing would see it immediately. It was a military dog tag, tarnished with age but still legible, and the name stamped into the metal was one that Daniel knew as well as his own. Lieutenant James Mercer, his grandfather. Daniel's hands were shaking so badly that he had to set the painting down and step back, taking deep breaths to steady himself. His grandfather had died in World War II, killed in action somewhere in France during the Allied push toward Germany. Daniel had grown up with stories about the grandfather he had never met, the brave young officer who had given his life for his country. There was a folded flag in his mother's house, a purple heart in a case that sat on the mantel, photographs of a handsome young man in uniform who would never grow old. And now here was that young man's dog tag hidden behind a painting of an unknown woman in the estate of a great-aunt who had never married and had never explained why. Daniel forced himself to focus, to approach this discovery with the analytical mind that had served him so well throughout his career. He picked up the dog tag and examined it closely, confirming that it was genuine, that the serial number matched the one he had memorized as a child when he used to hold his grandfather's second tag, the one that had been returned to the family after the war. This was the tag that should have stayed with the body, the one that was meant to ensure identification if the worst happened. And yet here it was, hidden in a painting, preserved for 7 decades in the home of a woman who should have had no connection to Lieutenant James Mercer. Unless she did have a connection. Unless the story Daniel had grown up believing wasn't the whole truth. He turned his attention to the package, carefully unwrapping the oilcloth to reveal what it protected. Inside were documents, dozens of them, some typed on official military letterhead, and others handwritten in a feminine script that Daniel didn't recognize. There were photographs as well, small black and white images showing scenes from what was clearly wartime Europe. And at the very bottom of the package, there was a letter addressed to whoever finds this, written in the same feminine hand. Daniel carried everything to his kitchen table, spreading the documents out under the bright light, Rex settling at his feet as if understanding that this moment required patience. And then Daniel began to read, piecing together a story that would change everything he thought he knew about his family, his grandfather, and the woman in the painting, who had stared out at the world for 7 decades, waiting for her secrets to be discovered. The story began in 1943 in the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut, where a young woman named Margaret Holloway was working as a nurse at the local hospital. She was 22 years old, intelligent and independent, with a fierce spirit that had already led her to reject 2 marriage proposals from local boys who couldn't understand why she wasn't content to settle down and start a family. She wanted more from life, she had told them. She just didn't know what that more might be.
And then Lieutenant James Mercer had walked through her door.
He had been stationed at a training camp nearby, preparing for the deployment that everyone knew was coming, the invasion of Europe that would finally turn the tide of the war. He had come to the hospital with a minor injury, a cut on his hand that had become infected, and Margaret had been assigned to treat him. From that first moment, something had passed between them, a recognition that transcended the ordinary attraction of a young man and young woman meeting under circumstances charged with the urgency of wartime. The letters documented what happened next, a romance conducted in the spaces between training exercises and hospital shifts, in stolen moments and whispered conversations, and a love that grew more intense with each passing day. James had known that he would be shipping out soon, that he might never come back, and that knowledge had lent a desperate edge to their relationship, a need to experience everything they could before time ran out. They had married in secret, Daniel read with growing amazement, a ceremony conducted by a sympathetic chaplain, witnessed only by James's best friend and Margaret's sister. They had told no one else, planning to announce their marriage when James returned from the war, when they could start their life together properly. But Margaret had known, even then, that she might become a widow before she could become a wife in the eyes of the world. Daniel's hands trembled as he turned the pages, absorbing the magnitude of what he was reading. His grandfather had been married, not to the grandmother he had known, but to Margaret Holloway, the great-aunt he had barely remembered. His entire family history was built on a secret that had been kept for 70 years. The letters continued, shifting to a correspondence between Margaret and James after he shipped out. They were the letters of young lovers separated by war, full of passion and longing and the desperate hope that they would be reunited. James wrote about the things he could safely share, the friendships he was forming, and the landscapes he was seeing, and the dreams he had for their future together.
Margaret wrote about the hospital and the town and the baby she was carrying, their child, conceived in the brief weeks they had been able to spend as husband and wife.
A baby! Daniel felt the room spin around him. There had been a child. He forced himself to keep reading, though every page brought new revelations that shattered the narrative he had believed his entire life. Margaret's pregnancy had been concealed, hidden from the community by the loose clothing of the era and the willing cooperation of her sister, the only other person who knew about the secret marriage. She had planned to reveal everything when James returned, to present him with their child and finally tell the world that they were a family. But James had never returned. The official telegram had arrived in November 1944, informing Margaret that her husband had been killed in action during the fighting in Belgium. She had received it at her sister's house, where she was staying until the birth, and she had collapsed with a grief that had threatened to destroy her. She was 19 weeks pregnant, alone, and now a widow whose marriage had never been publicly acknowledged. The next pages documented the impossible choices that Margaret had faced. She could reveal the secret marriage, claim her rightful place as James's widow, and raise their child as a single mother in a society that still attached stigma to such situations. Or she could remain silent, protect the reputation she had built, and find another way to ensure that her child was cared for.
She had chosen a third option, one that Daniel struggled to comprehend, even as he read the words that described it. James had a brother, William, who had been too young to serve in the war, but who had worshipped his older sibling with the devotion that younger brothers often showed. William had known about the secret marriage, had been the witness who had stood beside his brother during the ceremony. When James died, William had come to Margaret with a proposal. He would marry her himself. He would give the baby his name, would raise the child as his own, would preserve the family connection that James's death had threatened to sever. He loved Margaret not as a wife, but as the woman his brother had loved, and he was willing to sacrifice his own chance at a romantic life to honor his brother's memory. Margaret had agreed. She had married William Mercer 6 months after James's death, presenting their child to the world as the product of their union. The baby, a boy, had been named Daniel, after William's father. Daniel sat back from the table, his mind reeling. The man he had known as his grandfather, William Mercer, had not been his biological grandfather at all. He had been his great-uncle, a man who had married his brother's widow and raised his brother's child as his own. And Margaret Holloway, the distant great-aunt he had barely remembered, was not his great-aunt. She was his grandmother, the woman who had loved his real grandfather and borne his child, and then given up everything to protect the secret of that love. But there was more. The documents continued, and Daniel forced himself to keep reading, to understand the full scope of the deception that had shaped his family for 3 generations. Margaret and William's marriage had been one of convenience, an arrangement designed to protect the child and preserve the family's reputation. They had lived together as husband and wife, had maintained the appearance of a normal relationship, but they had never truly been partners in the romantic sense. William had never stopped mourning the brother he had lost, and Margaret had never stopped loving the man who had fathered her child. When the child, who had been named Thomas, grew up and married, Margaret and William had gradually drifted apart. William had died in his 60s, worn down by the weight of the secret he had carried and the life he had sacrificed, and Margaret had retreated to the house in Millbrook, surrounded by memories of the love she had lost and the choices she had made, waiting for the end that had finally come at 97 years old. But before she died, she had done something remarkable. She had created this package, this collection of documents and photographs and letters that told the true story of her life. She had hidden it behind the portrait that James had commissioned of her during their brief time together, the painting that he had meant to hang in the home they would build after the war. And she had written a final letter, addressing it to whoever might find what she had concealed. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before her death, written in a hand that trembled with age but remained legible. Daniel picked it up and began to read the words of the grandmother he had never known. "To whoever finds this," Margaret had written, "I hope you will try to understand why I did what I did. I was young and afraid, and living in a world that offered few good options to a pregnant widow whose marriage had never been recognized. I made choices that I believed were best for my child, and I have lived with the consequences of those choices for my entire life." James Mercer was the love of my life. We had only a few weeks together as husband and wife, but those weeks contained more happiness than many people experience in a lifetime. When he died, a part of me died with him. The only thing that kept me going was our child, the son who carried his father's blood and his father's spirit, even though he would never know the man who had given him life. William was a good man, and I will always be grateful for the sacrifice he made. He gave up his own chance at love to protect his brother's family, and he never once complained or expressed regret. He raised Thomas as his own son, gave him every advantage he could, and loved him in his own way, even though he knew the truth about his parentage. But the secret weighed on all of us. It created a distance between me and Thomas that I could never bridge, a barrier that prevented me from being the mother I wanted to be. I was always afraid that if I got too close, I would somehow reveal the truth, would say something that would expose the lie we had built our lives upon. And so I held myself back,
and Thomas grew up believing that his mother was cold and distant, never understanding that I loved him more than words could express.
When Thomas married and had children of his own, I watched from a distance a grandmother who was not quite a grandmother, whose relationship to her grandchildren was defined by a deception she could never reveal. I attended birthdays and holidays and graduations, playing the role that was expected of me, all the while knowing that the young people before me carried the blood of James Mercer, the man I had loved and lost so long ago.
I am old now, and I know that my time is short. I have decided to leave this record for whoever might find it, trusting that the right person will discover it at the right time. I cannot predict who that person will be or what they will do with this information, but I believe that the truth deserves to be known, that the secrets we carry in life should not follow us into death.
If you are reading this, know that I loved James Mercer with all my heart. Know that I loved our son Thomas, even if I could never show it. And know that I loved this painting, this portrait that James commissioned of me during our brief happiness, because it was the only thing I had left of him, the only reminder of the man who made me feel truly alive.
Whatever you decide to do with this information, I ask only that you remember us kindly. We were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, doing our best to navigate a world that offered no good options. We made mistakes, and we lived with the consequences. But we also loved, deeply and truly, and that love deserves to be remembered.
Margaret Holloway Mercer.
Daniel set the letter down and stared at the wall of his cabin, trying to process everything he had just learned. The woman in the painting was not just an unknown ancestor. She was his grandmother, the woman who had loved his biological grandfather and borne his father, and kept that secret for 7 decades. The grandmother he had known, William's wife, had been a convenient fiction, a story told to protect a family that was built on love and loss and impossible choices. And Rex had known. Somehow the dog had sensed something about that painting, had detected a connection that Daniel's human senses could never have perceived. Perhaps it was a scent, some trace of the woman who had hidden her secrets behind that canvas. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, some canine intuition that transcended the physical world.
Whatever it was, Rex had led Daniel to this discovery, had refused to let the painting go unnoticed, had drawn attention to the secrets it contained with an insistence that could not be ignored. Daniel looked down at the dog, who was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand everything. "Thank you, boy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for finding this." Rex wagged his tail and pressed his head against Daniel's leg, offering comfort in the way that only a dog could. The discovery behind the painting was just the beginning of Daniel's journey into his family's hidden history. Over the following months, he threw himself into research, tracking down every piece of information he could find about James Mercer, Margaret Holloway, and the secret marriage that had shaped 3 generations of his family. He found military records that confirmed James's service and death, including commendations for bravery that painted a picture of a man who had lived up to the highest ideals of military service. He found photographs of James and Margaret together, hidden in archives that Margaret had donated to local historical societies, their faces beaming with a happiness that made Daniel's heart ache. And he found living relatives who had pieces of the story, distant cousins who had heard rumors and hints but had never known the full truth. The most important discovery came from an unexpected source. Margaret's sister, the one who had witnessed the secret wedding and helped conceal the pregnancy, had kept her own record of events. When she died in the 1980s, her papers had been donated to a library in Connecticut, where they had sat unexamined for decades. Daniel found letters between the sisters that filled in gaps in Margaret's account, that added detail and context to the choices she had made. And he found one more thing, a letter that James had written to Margaret just days before his death, a letter that had somehow never been delivered, that had been returned to the family after the war, and had ended up in the sisters' possession. "My darling Margaret, James had written. "I am writing this letter not knowing if you will ever read it. We are about to go into battle, and I cannot shake the feeling that this might be my last chance to tell you how much you mean to me.
If I do not survive what is coming, I want you to know that our time together was the greatest gift of my life. In a world gone mad with war, you were my sanity, my anchor, my reason to believe that there was something worth fighting for. Every moment I spend away from you is a moment of longing for the life we will build when this is over."
I dream about our future, Margaret. I dream about coming home to you, about holding our child in my arms, about growing old together in a house filled with love and laughter. I dream about the family we will create, the generations that will follow us, carrying our love forward into a future we can only imagine. If I do not survive, please know that I died thinking of you. Please know that my love for you was the last thing in my heart, and that no matter what happens, that love will never truly end. It will live on in our child, in the life that grows within you, in the legacy we have created together.
I love you, Margaret. Today, tomorrow, forever. Your husband, James.
Daniel read this letter with tears streaming down his face, the words of a grandfather he had never known speaking to him across 7 decades of silence. James had loved Margaret with everything he had. He had died thinking of her and the child they had created, and that love, which Daniel had never known existed, had been the foundation of his entire family. He thought about his father, Thomas, who had died 10 years ago without ever knowing the truth about his parentage. He thought about his own children, grown now with families of their own, who carried the blood of James Mercer without knowing his name. And he thought about Margaret, the grandmother he had barely known, who had loved and lost and kept her secrets until the very end. The decision of what to do with this information weighed on Daniel for weeks. He could keep it private, preserving the narrative that his family had believed for generations, or he could share it, revealing a truth that would reshape how everyone understood their own identity and history.
In the end, it was Rex who helped him decide.
They were walking through the forest behind the cabin, following a trail that wound through the ancient trees, when Rex suddenly stopped and looked at Daniel with those intelligent eyes. The dog had been with him through everything, through the discovery and the research and the emotional turmoil of learning that his entire life had been built on a secret. And now Rex seemed to be waiting for something, watching Daniel with an expectancy that felt almost human.
"What do you think, boy?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside the dog. "Should I tell them?"
Rex wagged his tail and licked Daniel's face, a gesture that felt like affirmation, like encouragement to do what needed to be done. And so Daniel began the process of sharing the truth. He started with his siblings, gathering them for a family meeting at his cabin, where he laid out the documents and photographs and letters that told the story of their grandmother's secret. Their reactions varied, from shock to denial to tears to a strange kind of relief that came from finally understanding family dynamics that had always seemed slightly off, why their father had never seemed quite comfortable at Margaret's house, why Margaret had always held herself at a distance from her grandchildren, why there were gaps in the family history that no one had ever been able to explain. He shared the story with his children next, watching as they struggled to reconcile the grandfather they had known, William, with the truth that he had not been their biological ancestor. It was a difficult conversation, filled with questions that Daniel couldn't fully answer and emotions that would take time to process. But by the end of it, there was a sense of understanding, an appreciation for the complexity of the choices that had been made by people navigating circumstances that none of them could truly imagine. And finally, Daniel went public with the story, working with a historian who specialized in World War II to document what he had discovered. The story of James and Margaret Mercer became part of a larger narrative about wartime love and loss, about the sacrifices made by soldiers and the people who waited for them, about secrets kept and truths eventually revealed. The painting of Margaret was donated to a museum that specialized in World War II history, where it was displayed alongside the documents and photographs and letters that told her story. A plaque beneath it explained who she was and what she had experienced, transforming her from an unknown woman in an old portrait to a figure whose love and sacrifice would be remembered for generations.
Daniel visited the museum often, standing before the painting and looking into the eyes of the grandmother he had never known. Sometimes Rex came with him, the old dog sitting patiently at Daniel's feet while his human paid tribute to a woman who had loved and lost and kept her secrets for 70 years.
"I understand now," Daniel would say softly, speaking to the painted image as if Margaret could hear him. "I understand why you did what you did, and I want you to know that James's dream came true. The family you created together, the generations that followed, we're all here because of your love. We're all part of the legacy you built."
Rex would wag his tail at these moments, as if agreeing with Daniel's words, as if acknowledging the woman who had hidden her heart behind a canvas and waited for someone to find it.
The museum began receiving letters from people who had been touched by Margaret and James's story. Other families with their own wartime secrets came forward, inspired to share truths that had been hidden for decades. Veterans who had served with James in the war shared memories of the young officer who had spoken often of the woman he loved, who had carried a small photograph of her in his pocket until the day he died. And descendants of William, Daniel's step-grandfather, expressed gratitude that his sacrifice was finally being acknowledged, that his decision to marry his brother's widow and raise his brother's child was being recognized as the act of love and loyalty that it was.
The ripple effects of the discovery spread further than Daniel had ever imagined. Historians incorporated Margaret and James's story into their studies of wartime romance and the choices faced by women who lost husbands in combat. Writers used elements of the narrative in novels and films that explored the emotional costs of war.
And counselors shared the story with clients struggling with family secrets, using it as an example of how truth could eventually emerge and bring healing, even after decades of silence.
But for Daniel, the most meaningful consequence was something smaller, something personal.
He began to feel a connection to his grandfather, the real one, that he had never experienced before. He read James's letters over and over, absorbing the voice and personality of a man who had died before Daniel was born. He studied the photographs, looking for resemblances between his own face and the young officer who smiled out from images taken 80 years ago.
And he began to understand himself differently, recognizing traits and tendencies that he had always attributed to environment but now suspected had deeper roots.
The military career that had defined his life took on new meaning. He had followed in his grandfather's footsteps without knowing it, had served in wars and risked his life and carried the weight of experiences that most people couldn't imagine. James had been a soldier too, had faced his own battles and made his own sacrifices. The connection between them felt stronger now, a thread of continuity that stretched across the decades.
Rex remained at Daniel's side through all of it, the faithful companion who had started everything by staring at a painting and refusing to look away. The dog was getting older now, his muzzle gray and his movements slower, but his devotion to Daniel never wavered.
They still took their daily walks through the forest, still sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, still found comfort in each other's presence during the long nights when the memories of war pressed too close.
On the 5th anniversary of the discovery, Daniel returned to the auction house where it had all begun. The building had been converted into an antique mall, its former function as an estate liquidator replaced by a collection of vendors selling vintage furniture and collectibles. But the space still felt familiar, still held echoes of the day when Rex had led Daniel to a painting and everything had changed.
He stood in the spot where the painting had hung, remembering the moment when he had first seen Rex's fixed stare, the moment when he had decided to claim the portrait that had captured his dog's attention. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been only 5 years. So much had changed since then. So much had been revealed and processed and integrated into Daniel's understanding of himself and his family. Rex pressed against his leg, offering the wordless support that had sustained Daniel through everything. The dog couldn't possibly understand the significance of this place, the importance of the anniversary they were marking. But he understood that Daniel needed him, and that was enough.
"Thank you, boy," Daniel said, kneeling to scratch behind Rex's ears. "Thank you for finding her. Thank you for not letting me walk away."
Rex wagged his tail and licked Daniel's hand, accepting the gratitude with the grace that only dogs possess. They walked out of the building together, man and dog, moving into a future that was different from anything Daniel had imagined when he first received the notice about Margaret Holloway's estate. The secrets had been revealed, the truth had been told, and a family that had been built on love and deception and impossible choices was finally able to see itself clearly.
Margaret's portrait still watched over the museum exhibit, her eyes still holding the mysteries that had taken 7 decades to uncover. Visitors stood before her, read her story, and wondered at the choices she had made. And sometimes, when the light was right and the moment was quiet, people said they could almost see her smile, as if she was finally at peace, finally able to rest knowing that her secrets had been found and her love had been remembered. The painting was no longer just a portrait of an unknown woman. It was a testament to the power of love to endure through separation and death and decades of silence. It was a reminder that the people in old photographs and dusty paintings were once as alive and passionate and complicated as anyone living today. And it was proof that some secrets are meant to be found, that some truths are destined to emerge, no matter how carefully they have been hidden. Daniel understood all of this now, understood it in a way that he couldn't have before Rex had led him to the discovery that had changed everything. He was no longer just a retired soldier living alone in the mountains, trying to find peace after a lifetime of war. He was the grandson of James and Margaret Mercer, the inheritor of a love story that had survived death and deception and the long silence of years. He was connected to something larger than himself, part of a legacy that stretched back through generations and would continue forward through his children and grandchildren. And he owed it all to a German shepherd who had stared at a painting and refused to look away.
Rex passed away peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning, 10 years after the discovery that had brought him and Daniel together in such an unexpected way. He was 15 years old, ancient for a dog his size, and he had lived every one of those years with the dignity and devotion that had made him such an extraordinary companion.
Daniel buried him in the forest behind the cabin, in a spot they had visited countless times during their daily walks. He marked the grave with a stone that read, "Rex, he saw what others couldn't see." The grief was profound, a loss that reminded Daniel of all the losses he had experienced throughout his long life. But it was also tempered by gratitude, by the knowledge that Rex had given him something precious during the years they had shared. The dog had found him when he was lost, had led him to a discovery that had transformed his understanding of himself and his family, had been a faithful presence through everything that followed. Some people said that dogs were just animals, creatures of instinct without the capacity for deeper understanding. But Daniel knew better. Rex had understood something about that painting, had sensed a connection that transcended the physical reality of canvas and paint. He had seen what others couldn't see, and he had refused to let it go unnoticed. That was his gift. That was his legacy, and Daniel would carry it with him for the rest of his days. The museum that housed Margaret's portrait created a small exhibit about Rex, telling the story of the German shepherd who had discovered the secrets hidden behind the painting. Visitors learned about the remarkable bond between man and dog, about the way Rex had stared at the canvas and refused to look away, about the discovery that had followed, and the revelations that had transformed a family's understanding of its own history. Children especially loved the story, drawn to the idea of a dog who had solved a mystery that had remained hidden for 70 years.
They would stand before Rex's photograph, eyes wide with wonder, and ask their parents if their own dogs could do something similar, could find secrets that no one else could see.
Maybe, the parents would say. Dogs are remarkable creatures. They understand things we can't explain. And the children would nod, and they would go home and look at their own dogs with new eyes, wondering what secrets those furry companions might be able to reveal.
The story of Daniel and Rex and the painting became part of the larger narrative about the bond between humans and animals, about the ways that dogs had been helping people throughout history. It was shared in books and articles, discussed in classrooms and lecture halls, cited as an example of the remarkable capabilities that dogs possessed.
But for those who had known Rex, who had seen him stand before that painting with his eyes fixed on the woman who looked out from the canvas, the story was something more personal. It was a reminder that the connections between species ran deeper than training or instinct, that dogs could sense things that transcended rational explanation, that the love between a person and their dog was one of the purest forms of love that existed in the world.
Daniel lived for another 12 years after Rex's death, eventually passing away at the age of 78. He was buried in the cemetery where his biological grandfather, James Mercer, had been laid to rest after his body was finally returned from Europe in 1948. It was the first time they had been together in the same space, grandfather and grandson, their lives separated by death and secrets, but finally united in the peace of the grave.
The inscription on Daniel's headstone read, "Daniel Mercer, soldier and seeker of truth. He found what was hidden and brought it to light."
Beside it, a smaller marker commemorated Rex, his faithful companion, who saw beyond the canvas. And not far away, in the museum that had become the repository for the Mercer family story, Margaret's portrait continued to watch over all who visited. Her eyes still held their secrets, though they were secrets no longer, revealed to the world by a veteran and his dog who had refused to let the past remain buried. The story was complete now, the circle closed. A young woman's love, hidden for 7 decades, had finally been acknowledged. A soldier's sacrifice had been honored, and the descendants who had never known the truth were now connected to a legacy that gave new meaning to their lives.
All because a German shepherd had stared at a painting and refused to look away.
That was the power of the bond between human and dog. That was the gift that Rex had given to Daniel and to everyone whose lives had been touched by the discovery. And that was the legacy that would endure long after all the participants had passed from this world. A reminder that some secrets are meant to be found, and that love, true love, finds a way to be remembered.
The painting still hangs in the museum, watched over by the spirit of a woman who loved and lost, and kept her secrets until the very end. And sometimes visitors say they can feel something in the room, a presence that watches over them as they read the story of Margaret and James, and the dog who brought their love back to light.
Maybe it's just imagination. Maybe it's the power of a good story to shape our perceptions. Or maybe it's something more, a reminder that the bonds we form in life don't end with death, that the love we share continues to resonate through time.
Whatever it is, it's part of the legacy now, part of the story of a veteran who removed a painting from a wall and turned pale at what he found. Part of the mystery of a German shepherd who saw beyond the canvas to the secrets hidden within.
And part of the eternal truth that some things are meant to be discovered, no matter how carefully they have been concealed.